Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So today we're talking about John Rawls and his notion of justice as fairness. Rawls is arguably the most influential political philosopher of the second half of the 20th century, at least in the English-speaking world. Habermas is obviously the most influential in the German-speaking world, but Rawls, in ethics and political theory, he really casts a long shadow. So you saw early in this article, Rawls talks about the notion of practices. Practices is his shorthand for social institutions, right? What is incumbent, what is part and parcel, right, of a just social institution is his notion of fairness. Justice isn't a virtue, although again, its application can be virtuous. It's fairness essentially, right? We know now from psychological studies in the past 10-15 years that not just humans but animals like dogs can recognize unfairness, right? So it's Rawls' contention, right? It's his belief that at root of our notion of justice, again, what David Hume called an artificial virtue, right? One that we created, it's not natural, like say generosity or friendliness, right? But at root of justice is fairness, right? All right, so he's got two conditions, I believe he calls them, right? That define justice as fairness, right? And they appear on page 210. The first principle, right, holds, of course, he tells us, only if other things are equal. That is, while there must always be a justification for departing from the initial position of equal liberty, which is defined by the pattern of rights and duties, powers and liabilities established by a practice, and the burden of proof is placed on him who would depart from it, nevertheless, there can be, and often there is, a justification for doing so. So, in other words, right, really quickly, let me say a word about this notion of burden of proof. In a legal proceeding, you know that the prosecution has the burden of proof. What the burden of proof means is it's the duty, right, of the prosecution to prove guilt. It is not the responsibility of the defense to prove innocence, right? So that's what we mean by burden of proof. So what Rawls is talking about here is if someone is going to deviate from the course of justice, the course of fairness, they better have a really good excuse for why, right? Now, there might be some extreme circumstances in which one would deviate from this. The only historical example that comes to mind instantly is in 1863, at the height of the Civil War, then President Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, right? Habeas corpus means that you get to know what you're being charged with, right? So he suspended that during the Civil War because, again, there was a crisis situation. So that would be a situation, I suspect, in which Rawls would say, well, this was justified, right? It was an extreme, it was a departure from the norms of justice, right? But it could be justified, right? Second, right, the second principle of his notion of justice of fairness, right? Two, the second principle defines what sorts of inequalities are permissible. It specifies how the presumption laid down by the first principle may be put aside. Now, by inequalities, it is best to understand not any differences between officers and positions, but differences in the benefits and burdens attached to them, either directly or indirectly, such as prestige and wealth, or liability to taxation and compulsory services, right? So, inequalities, right? They're in a meritocracy, right? A meritocracy, that is to say, a system of governance in which people are recognized for having excelled, and they get perks for having done that, right? That's the kind of inequities, right, or inequalities, excuse me, that's Rawls' term, inequalities that Rawls has in mind here. And these, in his system of justice, can be justified as ways of incentivizing talented and intelligent people to do things, to create technologies, to create theories, to experiment, to do what they do to advance society, right? So these can be justified. So that's the basis, right? That's the background of Rawls' notion of justice as fairness. But he wants to contrast his view with that of a ethical / political theory that originated in the late 18th century with the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. It's most commonly associated today with John Stuart Mill and Peter Singer, namely utilitarianism. So really briefly, what's utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is the doctrine, ethical, again, political doctrine, that action is best. It tends to promote the greatest possible happiness for the greatest possible number, right? Rawls acknowledges the influence and the importance of utilitarianism, but he has critiques of utilitarianism. Some, again, I don't think are necessarily the most fair critiques, right? But among his critiques is the notion that we have to take everyone's happiness into account. So we would have to account for the loss of happiness of the slave owner if we were to decriminalize slavery, if we were to make slavery illegal, right? And Rawls is quick to point out, well, we don't need to recognize the unhappiness of the slave owner because slavery is an inherently unjust institution, which clearly it is. But my critique of Rawls' critique, if you will, is that the utilitarians would acknowledge that as well, right? Slavery tends to promote the happiness of an individual, namely the slave owner. It does not promote the greatest possible happiness for the greatest possible number. So again, I think Rawls is a bit unfair in his critique of utilitarianism. So to sum up, right, this is page 219, right? Rawls notes he's been talking about the concept of justice, right? And he says, I've tried to set out the kinds of principles upon which judgments concerning the justice of practices, again, practices being his term, his shorthand for social institutions, are said to stand, right? The analysis will be successful to the degree that it expresses the principles involved in these judgments when made by competent persons upon deliberation and reflection. Really quickly, a word about that. This particular article was written in 1957, I believe it was. It was published in 57, right? Rawls in 1971 published a book called A Theory of Justice, in which he proposed this notion called the veil of ignorance, in which he asks you, whenever you're making a moral decision, right, a decision with any kind of ethical or political ramifications, imagine yourself in a situation, imagine yourself as a person who didn't know the race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, educational level, etc. of the person you're interacting with, and then ask yourself what you would do, right? So in other words, he's asking you to be as objective as humanly possible. The critique, obviously, is, can human beings bracket off their biases? Well, the problem with that is, even if we can bracket off the ones we're conscious of, we may have unconscious biases, right? And obviously we can't shed those if we don't know where they are. I mean, we don't know what our biases are until we're confronted with them, right? Until somebody points them out, and then it becomes obvious to us. And we can make a self-critique. But Rawls extremely important because a lot of the people we're going to read and the rest of the remainder of the class are going to make reference to Rawls.